Beautiful fall day, and I am lucky to be on the Pivot Firebird today. Just an incredible, big travel, kind of enduro category bike. This thing's got 170 millimeters of travel up front, 165 in the rear. So it's fairly long on travel. After talking to the team about this bike, they actually suggested I go for medium since the reaches on these bikes are pretty dang long. Doesn't feel long, doesn't feel short, and even in the low setting, the C-tube angle is a 76.5 degrees. Definitely seems to keep that saddle forward enough where this bike, despite having kind of a shorter chainstay, can still really hold its own on really steep climbs. This bike's got a lot of anti-squat, which I've always experienced in the DW Link bikes. Preserves that rear geometry when you've got pressure on the pedals. Just keeps your back end supported. And it just kind of makes the bike feel more efficient when you're not squatting. Also makes it easier to kind of steer and make tight corners when you're going uphill. I think one of the most impressive characteristics about this bike is, it's a pretty big bike, 170 millimeter fork, and it just feels so efficient climbing. I honestly can't really feel the difference between this bike and a lot of the 140, 150 millimeter bikes I ride while climbing. The whole package is very lightweight since it's such a high-end build. And their carbon frames seem to be really light. Despite this being such a long travel bike, it's just a bike that I would have no question taking on a big 20, 30 mile, backcountry loop. Just because it carries its weight so well. And then when you can efficiently carry around all this suspension with you, I've been describing this bike as a super bike just because of how efficiently it gets around under pedal power, but at the same time just packs such a good supple punch when you're descending really bumpy terrain. It just seems to do so many different things so well. Yeah, when it comes to these really quite steep climbs, this bike, it almost starts feeling like, it's not got a ton of wheelbase. Like maybe it's gonna be a little hard to get up the super steep stuff. But then you apply the power and that anti-squat kind of raises the rear shock up. And all of a sudden you're just tractoring up this stuff. All right, just about to drop in here. This is where the good stuff starts. I've really enjoyed just being on such a big 170 bike. Just being able to send stuff pretty hard, not get bounced around too much. Just eats it up, especially when you're talking a coil shock with such a nice linkage system. Yeah, this bike is just incredibly supple. That rear coil shock, when it works with the linkage, is just so awesome. Just dives right into that travel, as I mentioned earlier. And then this 38, I don't know if it's the Kashima coating or what the story is, but it just feels so plush compared to any of the other Grip 2 38s that I've ridden. So when I first kind of got on this bike, I was really just kind of nervous about the medium size, and it's funny, I've grown to almost have that be my favorite part of this bike. Just keeps the whole package feeling so nimble, and when you combine a little bit more nimble feel with some big kind of hard-hitting suspension capabilities, it's just such a fun combination. Woo! And in the low setting, this bike has like a 434 chainstay. And I just feel like it's so slashy and exciting. but that longer travel kind of keeps things a little bit more capable feeling. Tell you what, it is a dusty out here. Holy buckets. You just feel like you can unleash this thing in a straight line to just devour chunk, but you're still able to slap it around. I do remember kind of earlier on riding this bike feeling a little bit like, oh, I'm getting pushed over the front wheel, just losing that little bit of reach, but took a few days to get used to the new balance of the bike, and now, as I said, I wouldn't have it any other way. Because another huge advantage to that kind of smaller wheelbase on this size medium is I can ride this bike so many more places, and it's kind of fun to have that long suspension on smaller terrain, because the faster you go anywhere, the more it beats you up. And I've just enjoyed not having as much wrist pain and just soaking things up so much more. Another one of my favorite features of the spec of this bike is I've never really been on Shimano XTR brakes. I've always been a big Shimano lover. I love the bite of the Shimano brakes and just the no nonsense power. And I just feel like these XTRs are really super good about heat fade and just lasting the whole mountain. This bike's got the full package with the fin pads and the Ice Tech rotors, and it's just so good. I just love not having the brakes be on my mind. And I just feel like that rear end just absorbs so much energy. You just pump this bike out of a corner too. Yeah, this bike pumps through the terrain, you know, just as well as any big 170 bike that I've ever ridden. It's just, you get a lot of return at the bottom of like a compression, and I think that's because of those short chainstays. I think that's because the rear leverage curve of the bike just really ramps up. So you got a lot of mid-stroke support and a ton of bottom out support. I don't even know if I've ever bottomed this bike out with all that travel and all that ramp up. It's kind of hard to tell with the coil, I feel like. Also like frame construction, stiff without being too stiff, and that rear solid rear end is just very trustworthy feeling. It just seems like all those pivot points are kind of forward on the frame in this design, and I just love the idea of having just a solid one-piece rear end to the bike. I just think that's so cool, and it's just so impressive the level of control that Pivot has when they're tuning those leverage curves. It's just like it does all the things you'd want a bike to do. Tons of pedal support, ridiculously supple off the top, massive ramp up, decent mid-stroke support, right? Like it's just like, good job. Woo! I feel like it's so fun to just kind of pump your weight around this bike too. And the more time you get on it, the more you just feel like you know exactly what the tires are gonna do and where you can push to find grip. Ah, so much bottomless suspension too. Saving my wrist right now, keeping me fresh. Any big descents on a 170 bike and not get so beat up. I will say this bike isn't like, it's not all about stability, especially if you size down like I did. It's a lot more about agility and nimbleness. Like I'm fairly confident any 170 millimeter travel bike is going to be quite stable, but this thing, it's just how well you can tuck it into little corners and stuff. That's really what makes it special. It's not the longest wheelbase in the world, and it, you know, it's not one of those bikes where you want to fall asleep at the wheel while riding. It's an active bike. I think if you went to the size up or the standard size, it would for sure be a lot more just inherently stable, but I love how agile this thing is. Woo! It's just so fun to like push this thing into a corner hard. It's got the spirit of a little bike, I think, which makes it so fun, but it doesn't fatigue you like a little bike. It's got a fairly high feeling bottom bracket to me, and just keeps this thing so whippy, quick to change your weight and stuff. So who's this bike for? I'd say this bike is for riders that really want to like have a very agile, well pedaling 170 millimeter bike. I mean, this thing's definitely at home in the bike park, but maybe just size up. And you know, their intended purpose, like you can race enduros on this thing. It's gonna be sick. Just feels very race bred. Feels like this thing's been designed by really good riders. So impressive. So if you enjoyed this review, consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. And for the full write-up, head on over to freeupmag.com. Phew!